Greetings, comrades. Gregor here. The folks at wargaming.net have not exactly made new nations a priority of development for World of Tanks for some time now, but some existing nations have had more lines fleshed out. For instance, the Tier 10 KV-2 that the Brits get in the form of a tank destroyer, and of course the more recent Japanese Heavies, which are going to be coming very, very soon in Update 9.10. Now, Japan also, of course, has the distinction of being the most recently introduced nation to the game, but that still was some time ago. It's obvious to everyone that the Japanese Heavies are essentially conceptual designs. I mean, look at Godzilla right here. You know, for a while, the mouse was the standard of what a absurdly large tank was supposed to look like. Now it's been trumped. I don't know how that works, but hey, wargaming will do what wargaming will do. I'm excited for the Japanese Heavy line. I think it's going to add some interesting elements of play to the game. However, some sources on the front line some time ago revealed that Wargaming is indeed working on the introduction of a new nation's worth of tanks to the game, consisting of designs originating in Czechoslovakia. And for a while, the Czechoslovakian tanks were assumed, it was assumed that they were going to be a part of a European national branch that basically would consist of tanks from various lesser-known factions built during the mid-20th century. So that way, everyone can sort of get their own little bit of representation in the game, because while not necessarily every nation had a full tech tree's worth of tanks that could possibly work in World of Tanks, they could become basically smaller pieces of a larger whole. But apparently Czechoslovakia has enough designs lying around. While most of them didn't really get off of the drawing board, they did have enough concepts on paper to implement in World of Tanks, and now we get to see what they look like. We get an idea of how they would probably function. So in addition to great beer, the Czechs had a fair bit of interesting tank designs that were in production before the outbreak of the Second World War, and some of these designs even saw uses by the German army in combat. You can tell, in fact, World of Tanks already features a few Czech tanks in the form of low-tier vehicles like the Panzer 38T and its tank destroyer derivative, the infamous Hetzer, among others. But the question on a lot of people's minds is just how the hell are they going to implement this tree? Because there have been a lot of growing pains for the Czechoslovakian tech in World of Tanks, and it's something quite obscure to the average player base. I mean, everybody knows what the M4 Sherman is, the T-34, the Panzer. No one knows what the Skoda manufacturing company is, maybe outside of Europe. I didn't even know that these tanks were even happening in the first place until I started reading up on them from World of Tanks insider blogs, like For the Record, and more recently Read a Status Report, which was, of course, recently promoted by Silent Stalker, the man behind For the Record, commonly seen as the father of the Czechoslovakian tank tree in its current state in World of Tanks. But now it's official, because we have information that has been revealed at Gamescom in the form of a final Czechoslovakian tech tree put together by the Wargaming team. Now, as you can see, it's pretty basic. It's more like a tech line, even more simplistic than the Japanese tech tree at its introduction, which only had a medium line up to tier 10 and an option to place some low-level light tanks along the way. This tree is essentially a medium line all the way up to tier 10, one tank per tier, with a tier 6 premium. Some of these models have already been finished, as I'm going to show some on the screen. You can see that these vehicles seem to blend characteristics of Soviet and German tank designs. The Christie suspension seen here that's used on the T-34 and its derivatives. Also note the sloped but still relatively boxy design of the hull. That's a little more German, but especially the gun mantlet. This sort of cone-shaped gun mantlet that you'll find on a large number of German tanks, especially tank destroyers like the Tiger, and a couple other medium tanks like the E-50M and the Panther II, so on. None of these Czechoslovakian tanks are particularly well known amongst audiences outside of Europe, aside from the LT VZ35 and the LT VZ38 that now exist in the German tree as the Panzer 35T and the Panzer 38T, respectively. But each has a history unto their own, and obviously they're unique enough to warrant introduction to the game. So I'm going to go through them individually. I'm going to give a brief history of each vehicle and how we would probably expect to see it perform in-game, along with any other things that I notice along the way. To basically summarize the history of Czechoslovakian tank designs, at least what you see here Czechoslovakian engineers clearly demonstrated an aptitude for putting together reliable designs. One of the comments that German tankers would make often about their Czech design tanks was that they were very easy to work on, and they were just really reliable. They were very low maintenance machines. And the Czechoslovakian engineers were tasked by the governments of the various forces that occupied their lands during the mid-20th century with a number of projects, but most of them didn't even leave the drawing board due to bureaucratic influence. So, starting off with the low-tier light tanks up to Tier 3. Now, they're classified as light tanks, but as we're all aware, that can mean just about anything in low tiers. But you're probably already familiar with these vehicles if you decide to go down the already existing German heavy line, at least the Porsche heavy tank line with the mouse. Aside from the Tier 1, the Kolohosenka, which, if you were to literally translate that term into English, it means wheeled track, and you can see why. In the pictures here, it's a rather peculiar design, kind of strange looking, but as you can see if you look closely, it's based on the hull of the Renault FT. Again, another Tier 1 Renault FT. I know, we can't get enough of them. This vehicle was designed to incorporate the favorable characteristics of both tracks and wheeled vehicles, since during the early 20s, tracks were very susceptible to breakage, and you wanted to maximize their lifespan. The idea was to use the wheels on long stretches of road and the tracks for off-road driving and combat. It was an engineering catastrophe, understandably, and only saw usage as a training vehicle. This vehicle will make usage of its tracks rather than its wheels in-game, as you can see in the rough 3D render of it here, and will be free XP'd by just about everyone going down this line anyway, so hey. The other two light tanks featured are designs that existed in reality and attained a respectable service record in usage by the German Army during World War II, the LT-VZ-35 and VZ-38, both designated as Panzers upon their acquisition. These vehicles were considered reliable and easy to operate and repair, and as such saw usage in the early Blitzkrieg campaigns in Poland and France. But they proved inadequate in comparison to Soviet designs like the T-34 due to inadequacy in their armament. So the 38T's hull was adapted into a number of different vehicles, including tank destroyers and self-propelled guns, some of which also exist in the German tank tree of World of Tanks as well. In-game, these vehicles will function almost identically to their German equivalents as reasonably mobile tanks with accurate guns. At Tier 4, the Czechoslovakian tanks get a little more weight, and the meat of the line starts. The STVZ-39, known in most of the articles you might read up on it as the V8H, was designed by the CKD company, one of the largest engineering groups in Czechoslovakia at the time. After some successful prototypes were built, it was offered to a number of different countries, but interest in the vehicle wasn't very high due to its high cost and the complexity of the design. It was scheduled to be put into mass production with the Czechoslovakian army, but bureaucratic hurdles kept this from happening, and the German army that seized Czechoslovakia soon after did not find it a very interesting design. Characteristics concerning its horsepower per ton ratio and armor suggest this vehicle will function like a cruiser-style medium, similar to the British early-tier light tanks. Tier 5 sees the introduction of designs by the well-known Skoda company, CKD's main competition. This design, the T-24, was Czechoslovakian in origin, but it was commissioned by the occupying German army, as they found the Soviet T-34 to be a particularly troublesome machine to deal with. So a comparable medium tank needed to be implemented quickly, and so this design was born. A drawing was made, but the project was quickly cancelled as another heavier design, the T-25, showed more promise. Here you can see some characteristics of German design being implemented, such as this gun mantlet that you would find on a tank like the Panther, but the hull itself is sloped, like the T-34, as well as what appears to be a Christie suspension system. In-game, it will likely function in a similar capacity to the T-34, with gun handling characteristics similar to other German mediums. The Tier 6 hosts the T-25, which already exists in World of Tanks as a Tier 5 premium medium tank for the Germans. Initial proposals met German testing expectations, but the project was eventually scrapped for logistical reasons pertaining to the materials needed to build it. It's essentially an upgraded T-24, and the people who have driven this tank can attest to its favorable characteristics: reasonably fast speed in a straight line, and a reasonably accurate high-pen gun. less favorable characteristics are found in slow traverse speeds. The only other tank at Tier 6 the Czechoslovakian tech tree has is the T-40, and Wargaming the company has made a note to show it off a little bit as seen in these renders and clips here. We can see a few things that distinguish the Czechoslovakian designs, notably how they'll appear in game, with a lighter tannish olive drab, and the tricolor blue, red, and white insignia can be seen here as well. This tank was a design that came about at a later time, right before Czechoslovakian territory was claimed by the Soviet Union in their fighting towards Berlin. The basic design principle was to create a tank that was meant to cover as much ground as possible in terms of functionality, in the way that a main battle tank might. In-game, it seems like a reasonably maneuverable cruiser-style tank, and further searches reveal that the gun has characteristics functionally identical to the Tiger's 88mm gun. It's coming to the game ahead of the main tree's introduction, and will provide an avenue for interested players to train their crews ahead of time. Looks pretty interesting to me. At Tier 7, we see how Czechoslovakian designs changed drastically from the onset of their inclusion into the USSR. The basic idea here was simple: mount a 100mm gun onto a T-34. Conveniently, a 100mm gun of suitable effectiveness was being produced in Slovakia at the time. So, a T-34 with a 100mm gun, what could possibly go wrong? It sounds like it will either be really good or a slow and unwieldy pile of junk. Who knows? If it's anything like most of the Tier 7 medium tanks, it will probably be horrible and something to free XP past. So, by the end of World War II, Czechoslovakian engineers had a certain level of autonomy and were tasked with creating some designs that would meet the requirements of the Soviet Ministry of Defense. VTU, the Military Technical Institute, drafted a plan for a main battle tank that utilized Soviet and German design elements, much like the designs that we've looked at before. The tank went through several different versions on the drawing table and showed great promise. So the Skoda company, now nationalized by the USSR, was given the ball, and their work eventually evolved into a few other designs that complete the Czechoslovakian tree and World of Tanks, starting at Tier 8 and ending at Tier 10. Its designation, TVP, an acronym for Universal Tank. Tier 9 hosts the T-50, essentially what exists as an upgraded version of the Tier 8 equivalent. The T-50 was proposed to a committee, but soldiers brought up a number of concerns, such as the tank's tall profile and heavy weight. After a series of meetings, the project was cancelled. Tier 10 hosts the continuation of this design, and ultimately the final version of this project. This vehicle, again, essentially being an upgrade from the previous designs, with the introduction of a rounded turret, a common feature of many Soviet main battle tank designs at this time. But for more logistical reasons, this design never made it off of the drawing board in favor of the T-54. There's not much to speculate as to how these vehicles would perform that hasn't already been said, a sort of midway between the playstyle of the German Leopard and the Soviet T-62, reasonably mobile with a hard-hitting gun. In the case of the Tier 10, it's confirmed that it's going to be getting an autoloader, so obviously very high DPM as well. So as of now, we don't know if Wargaming plans on introducing other classifications of vehicles to the Czechoslovakian tree, rather than a Czechoslovakian line of medium tanks, being that it's only comprised of those medium tanks. There are examples that existed in reality of Czechoslovakian-designed heavy tanks and tank destroyers. Whether or not these vehicles will be implemented as mini branches, lines of their own, or premium tanks remains to be seen. But what we have on offer right now seems interesting enough, and will likely provide some interesting aspects for the game's meta. If you found the history of these vehicles interesting, I highly recommend checking out Silent Stalker's blog at For the Record. I'll leave a link to the Czechoslovakian articles in the description. The tech tree is coming in update 9.12, which will probably come about in December of this year. So are you interested in Czechoslovakian tech being introduced to the game? Is Wargaming overreaching just a little bit with the paper designs concept? Are you going to pick up the Tier 6 when it comes out? I sure will, and I'll likely review it too. Start a discussion in the comments. Feel free to like and share this video to other people you think might be interested in this, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe for more content like this, since I'll definitely be covering these machines when they come out on the 9.12 test server. My name's Gregory Aaron Havener, take it easy, and thanks for watching.